session. It's my privilege now to invite Dr. Judd Walson to give us the final talk.
Good morning, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I'm going to start by just framing this as not really about seasonal treatment or intermittent treatment, but really, can we come up with a solution for all to address child mortality? But I want to frame this around whether or not the use of azithromycin when added to SMC might be beneficial. And a recent study by Brian Greenwood, again, et al. In New England Journal, demonstrated that there was no added mortality benefit when azithromycin was added to SMC. So I want to just back up now, and we're going to walk through a little bit about around the data for the use of azithromycin for child survival, and talk about some strategies that we might think about given that finding. So as many in this room will certainly appreciate, child mortality has reduced drastically over the last several decades, but that reduction has not been equitable across the world, and there still remains a large burden of mortality, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Even within the African continent, there's great diversity in mortality rates. And if we look here at a sort of 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer model from IHME, you can see that really child mortality is very, very much isolated to specific pockets of the continent. So previously, in around 2007, a study was conducted in Ethiopia, a very large cluster randomized trial, which demonstrated a very significant, almost 50% reduction in child mortality with biannual azithromycin delivered as it is through a mass drug administration program, such as is used for trachoma management. And that generated quite a lot of excitement, obviously. Such a large reduction in mortality was really unexpected, and I think for many people was really hard to believe, really. We were asked at that time, our group was asked by the Gates Foundation to consider, if that was true, how would we go about addressing where this would most likely be beneficial. So we created a tool that assessed all of the factors that we believed might be underlying that mortality reduction. So including what the prevalence and incidence of diseases that might be impacted by azithromycin, such as diarrheal disease, malaria, et cetera, might be, what the coverage rates for other interventions such as immunizations and insecticide-treated bed nets, et cetera, were. And we sort of compiled all this to try to say, where would we see the biggest benefits from azithromycin? I show this just because I have the very rare opportunity of patting myself on the back, which happens very, very rarely, because the number one country we identified that would benefit from azithromycin was Niger. Fast forward now, that was, by the way, in 2009. Now we'll fast forward till last year, when the results of the Mordor trial were released. This is a large, again, cluster randomized trial conducted in Malawi, Niger, and Tanzania, with a biannual treatment of children aged 1 to 59 months with azithromycin for 2 years, and really looking at mortality as a primary outcome. And as you can see here, there was a 13.5% reduction in all-cause mortality among the children, with a larger effect size seen among the younger children. I'll let you just see that for a second. I think the other really important note here is that the study's primary endpoint was to look at the cumulative mortality across all 3 aggregated countries. It was not designed to specifically look at each country separately as a primary outcome. But when you look at those separate individual country mortality rate reductions, you'll see that it was only significant in Niger. So the entire mortality reduction was really driven by Niger. Now, subsequent analyses have gotten into this a little bit further. I won't go into that here, but it is really quite exciting. Of course, the concern is that with mass drug administration of an antibiotic such as azithromycin, will we see resistance? And as you can see here, in the MDA-treated villages, there was a rapid increase in drug resistance in those communities. Once that study completed, there was sufficient interest in exploring what the whether this effect would be persistent. And so Mordor 2 was not a randomized trial, but what they did was go into those same communities in Niger that had experienced benefit, and in the control communities, they went ahead and treated with biannual azithromycin over the year, and in the treatment communities, they continued treatment. And what you can see here, number one, is that the intervention communities had a sustained response. So even in the presence of increasing drug resistance, there appeared to be a sustained response in terms of mortality reduction. And in the control communities, there was a drop in mortality that was almost the exact same impact as the overall impact seen in the Mordor trial. So currently there are a number of trials that have now been reported that have shown significant reductions in child mortality with the use of azithromycin. This shows just a pooled analysis of that. So I think there's fairly compelling evidence that azithromycin, when delivered by MDA, can have an impact. But there's also fairly significant concern that over an extended period of use, we would see a great increase in drug resistance to macrolides. And macrolides, as you all know, are used not only for blanket treatment for trachoma and other things, but they're important class of antibiotics for a number of other disease states. So this is really a concern. And while studies, as shown here, often show a rapid decrease in resistance when drug pressure is removed, we really don't have long-term data to see what happens over many, many years of treatment. And of course, with almost everything else in our armamentarium, multiple years of treatment usually leads to fairly sustained increases in resistance, and so that concern remains. The other concern is, as you saw in the Mordor results, those results appeared to be limited to Niger largely. And so what is it about Niger that made that such a benefit, and what is it about Tanzania and Malawi that made it less of a benefit? And so people have speculated about underlying diseases, about underlying mortality rates. There's a lot of potential reasons. But I think a lot of people think that in very high mortality rate areas, azithromycin may be an approach. So I think it's worth thinking about, are there other ways that we might achieve this same sort of benefit beyond mass drug administration of entire communities or all children in communities? Could we actually think about targeting children who are at particularly high risk of death? So first of all, I think it's important to recognize the benefits of MDA, of mass drug administration. So this chart really from the Lancet shows that when you look at coverage for a whole variety of different types of intervention, coverage rates, number one, tend to be fairly low, around 50 to 60% generally, if you average them out across a whole range of interventions. But the other important things is they're very inequitably distributed. If you look by wealth quintile, you can see that almost always the poorest communities, those that will serve who serve to benefit the most, generally have the lowest coverage. There's also a very wide spread in coverage across most interventions. And where we have very, very tight ranges in coverage, it's because we uniformly have bad coverage. In areas where we have high coverage, they tend to be very large distributions of coverage. MDA programs, on the other hand, tend to achieve relatively high coverage and appear to be among the most equitable delivery platforms that we have across a whole range of different types of interventions. This is from the Tumikia study. It was a mass drug administration program for soil-transmitted helminths in Kenya, but I think this has been shown for a number of MDA programs that the equity of delivery and the equity of benefit is much greater for MDA programs for others. So that's a real argument for the potential benefit of MDA. Now, remember, I said that a lot of people argue that in lower mortality areas such as Malawi and Tanzania, azithromycin may not have benefit, and so we should restrict our thinking of this MDA approach to high mortality areas. But if we look at IHME projections for what the mortality rates of these high mortality areas will look like by the time we're likely to be able to scale something. I mean, it takes 5, 10, 15 years to scale a program of this size. If we just go out 15 years to 2030, projections are that Niger's under 5 mortality will basically mirror exactly where Malawi and Tanzania are now. And so we have to think about how timely we can get this intervention going if we go with that approach. Lastly, in terms of MDA, I think it's important to recognize that for many interventions for which we use MDA, lymphatic filariasis, trachoma, other things of that nature, we do so with an elimination goal in mind. And so there's a stop. We can think of when we end. Child mortality is never going to end. So if we start azithromycin programs, what's the end game? When do we stop those programs? And I think that's a really important point if we think about these MDA programs. But can we target the most vulnerable? I'm going to go quickly given our time, but I will say it's important to recognize, I don't know how to go backwards, there we go. We do know that there are some factors that underlie most under 5 deaths, and those are younger age, having poor anthropometry or markers of malnutrition, and having presented to a health system with an acute illness. If you take those 3 indicators, you have identified the vast majority of children who will die in any community. Now, it's true that less than half of all kids with febrile illness do present for medical care, and in many settings it's even lower. So is this approach going to work if we try to target people in health facilities, given that many of these children never show up, right? But there's a number of studies that have looked not at the number of children with illness who come in, but of all children who die, how many were seen in a health facility, because that's actually the population we're interested in. And in fact, uniformly in these studies, over 80% of children who died sought health care in the previous 2 weeks. So the health systems we have now, and these are in areas that we often think of as having relatively low health care access. So I think these are important studies. Also, having access to that health system is important, but we know that when children leave the health system, they have exceptionally high risk over the next 6 months to a year. Post-discharge mortality after hospitalization is very, very high. In fact, in some studies, the mortality in children who've left a health facility is about 10-fold higher than in children who are in the community and not been hospitalized. So hospital discharge might be an ideal targeting strategy where we could find children at a very high risk of death. We have them physically present with a system that could deliver an intervention, and so we're really quite interested in this. So why do these children die? I think there's a lot of reasons that we're not going to get into a lot, but I think it could be that they're chronically exposed to multiple pathogens that could be treated by azithromycin. They could have just underlying inflammation and other enteric dysfunction that compromises their nutritional status and ultimately leads to translocation, bacteremia, etc. They could have nosocomial acquired infections. There's a lot of reasons, and we don't really know the mechanism by which azithromycin is preventing mortality, but there's a good reason to think many of these could be treated with azithro. So I just wanted to highlight we are conducting a randomized trial of azithromycin targeting children 1 to 59 months who are being discharged from hospital. This is called the Totobora trial. It's a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. We've now completed enrollment and are completing follow-up in the next few months. And so really looking forward to being able to share these results with you soon. And this is just the study design. I won't go into that. Finally, I just want to acknowledge all of the folks who have worked on this Totobora trial and some of this work. And I'm happy to sit up here and answer any questions as part of the panel. So thank you very much.